Yes, if you want.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our debate this afternoon on what to price coal. I'd like to introduce you to our chairman, Ian, who will then introduce the panel. We will be able to debate until 6:45, and then we have to clear for tonight's performance. Thank you very much for coming, all of you.
Yes.
Have a good debate.
Thank you. Well, shall we make a start? Good evening, everybody. Yeah, I'm Ian Clayton. I'm chairing tonight's debate. I'm a writer and former television presenter and a teacher. And I'm from a pit village in West Yorkshire called Featherstone. And I'm first lad in our family not to work in pit since 1848. I did my family tree. And I found out that my family had been working in pit since 1848. It's a long time. So that's me, in case you were wondering. And now I'll introduce our panel. Let's start on this side and ladies first. Jean Miller, she's from Barnsley Women Against Pit Closures, and anybody who's in this room are aware of the work that the Women Against Pit Closures did starting 30 years ago and still to this day. Next to Jean is Andy Birchall, and Andy is a Lancashire lad.
I am, yes.
And an ex-coal miner himself, and now an academic. Would that be fair to say?
Sort of.
All coal miners who became academics are always shy when it comes to that. Yeah. And then here is KEITH Stanley, and Keith is the former Vice President of the National Union of Mineworkers. Yeah. And here is Richard Mallender, and Richard is the chair of the Green Party in Nottinghamshire.
No,
National. I beg your pardon, Richard. They told me Nottinghamshire.
I stood down at the last AGM.
All right. So you're the. Tell me properly.
I'm chair of the Green Party National Executive.
The chairman of the Green Party's National Executive. Very important man next to me there. Okay. And then finally we've got Martin Brandon Bravo, who is a former Conservative MP and was an MP during the strike, Martin.
Yes.
Okay. I've been thinking about this today. I was at Barnsley NUM headquarters this morning for the unveiling of a Women Against Pit Closures banner. And then we came down, and I've been thinking it could get a bit tasty, could this debate, a bit heated. So I'm going to insist on good manners, I think, at all times. Is that all right? We'll have a good-mannered debate. You're laughing, some of you. Is that a good sign? Good luck. Okay, well, we'll do our best. I've got some questions ready that have already been put in, so we'll start with them. And as soon as I can, I'll open up to yourselves. And just indicate to me if you've got a question ready already, or you might ask a question as we go along. Put your hands up if you have got a question. Not yet, but you might have. There. Oh, there's one there, yeah. Okay, well, I'll get to you as we go along. But first, we'll start with this question. Was the decision to close the pits an economic one or a political one? And I'm going to come straight to you, Keith, with that first question. Was it an economic decision or a political one, in your opinion?
My opinion is that it was definitely political, and I think it was based on revenge. And the revenge was because of the role that the miners played in 1974, when the Ted Heath government was removed. I don't think they ever forgive the miners for that, and it carried on, obviously, later. When Thatcher beat Heath for the leader of the Tory party elections in 1975, very quickly after that, the Ridley report was introduced by the Tories, and the Ridley plan was actually made up of tactics on how to defeat nationalised industries if they were to take industrial action. And when you look at the pinpoints of the Ridley plan, it's quite obvious to me that the strike was caused by the Tories and led by the Tories in many ways, because one of the first things in the pinpoints of the plan it says that the government should possibly choose the battlefield on which to fight. Well, I'm sure that you'll all remember very early on in the miners' strike, we had the battle at Orgreave. And in Nottinghamshire at that time, it was a police state, and you couldn't move in or out of Nottinghamshire without being met by police on roadblocks. For us, trying to get picketing anywhere else in the country, it was virtually impossible. But on the day that the Orgreave battle took place, there was absolutely no police on any of the motorway junctions. In fact, when we got to Sheffield and were heading towards Orgreave, the police stopped us and actually showed us the way into Orgreave. I think they absolutely meant us on that day. They went to prove a point, and we got battered. Quite a lot of the miners got battered that day, and it was their intention. But when you look further down the pinpoints from the Ridley plan, it says that the coal stocks should be built up at the power stations. That happened. And then they said that they should plan to make import coals come from the foreign ports that were non-union. And also non-union lorry drivers should be recruited by haulage companies. And then, of course, it says build up a police force to mobilise the police so that they're ready for employ riot tactics and also to stop violent picketing. This was done in 1977, and that is actually well before the strike took place. So I think they were leading up to it, getting ready for it, and Thatcher in 81 started naming pits that were to close, and some of them were in the South Wales area. The South Wales miners came up into Nottinghamshire and asked for help, and the areas did offer the help to the South Wales miners, and that is when Thatcher did the famous U-turn, and she said that she would support the coal industry in 1981. What happened after that is clear to everybody, because I think they picked on a pit that was from a volatile area, Corton Wood in Yorkshire. They said in 1 week that Corton Wood had got 5 years coal left at it, and then in the next week they announced the closure of Corton Wood, knowing full well that the miners in Yorkshire would support their comrades at Corton Wood and come out on strike. So I think they led the strike by doing that to Corton Wood, and then other areas obviously followed suit, and the strike began from there.
Thank you, Keith. I'm going to come over to you, Martin. Keith says that the Tories caused the strike and the police showed the pickets where to find the battlefield. What do you say to that?
Let me make my statement, and I'll try and see if I can deal with that.
Okay.
Because I think it was both economic and, of course, political. I wouldn't deny it. It was clearly both. And whatever you might feel to the contrary, I think politicians of all parties don't take decisions out of bigotry or evil intent, whatever you may think. But if circumstances change, if a product, not just coal, if a product is no longer viable, no longer needed, or can be produced elsewhere more cheaply, then the politics of good governance in the national, rather than any narrow local interest, often require very tough decisions to be made, and I won't resile from that. Now, for many years, and you mentioned it yourself, for many years before the Troubles of '84, pits were being closed. You'll know that in the 1920s and 30s, hundreds closed. You'll also know that many were worked out. There were technical problems that might have become insurmountable. There may have been the situation where the cost of extraction had become prohibitive, because back then, correct me if I'm wrong, most of it was pick and shovel and not the kind of mechanical mining that we were used to in the 70s and 80s. And the Gedling pit had massive cutters. It was fantastic to go down there. I wouldn't have worked down there, but they deserved every penny they earned. But I have to say, contrary to the popular rewriting of history, there were more pits closed under the Wilson-Callaghan Labour government than in the 80s under the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher. And try and tell me I'm wrong, because you know that happens to be true. So both major political parties had tough decisions to make, and more closed under Harold Wilson than closed under Maggie Thatcher. Now, you're quite right, the government of Edward Heath was effectively brought down by the miners' strike of 74, and could have been brought down in 81. And so when you say the government prepared for it to happen again, what sensible government wouldn't prepare, having faced it in 74, having faced it in 81? If they had not made preparation in case it happened again, they would have been failing in their duty. So I find no fault in that. But I have to, through to you, Keith, in 1984, when I was in Parliament, the average price of our deep mine coal was around £45 per tonne, and the much despised open cast coal was only £15 a tonne. Yet there were mines still working that were on that list for closure that you spoke of, that were producing coal at over £100 per tonne. It simply couldn't go on, Keith. It's not the way to run anything. So a political decision, which is why I say it was both, was inevitable. And I believe, sincerely, that if that reality had been accepted by the NUM, then I think the restructuring and the necessary closures could have been handled with greater sensitivity and much more humanely. But if anybody thinks a government could have had a rational negotiation with Arthur Scargill, then they are blind to the realities of that time. Thank you, Chairman.
When you say the government, what government wouldn't prepare, that suggests to me that the government were preparing.
Sorry?
When you say that the government, what government would not prepare if this ever happened again, that suggests to me that the government were preparing.
Yes, and
So-
they would have been wrong not to. They weren't saying we want a strike. What they were saying was if there's going to be another threat like 81, then we must be prepared to
Yes.
be able to fight our corner. And that's what they did. And you're quite right, the coal stocks were very high. You talk about choosing the battleground. Dear Arthur chose completely the wrong one at the start of summer.
Keith, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I do. If that's the case, then why didn't the government come clean at the time when they said that there were only a 20-pit hit list? And then we've found, since the official secrets have come out this year, that there were 70 pits named. So they were playing games with the miners back in 1984 and not telling us the truth.
I can't answer that one. I have never seen the list.
It's been published in the
Yeah,
newspapers
well, I
in
haven't
the
seen
last
it.
few weeks. Jean, have you got a comment on this?
Well, I think what this government was about was breaking the trade unions, which is why the government encouraged private people to mortgage the houses, to buy lorries, to move the coal out of the pits. How could they stop working? They'd lose the wagons, they'd lose the houses, they'd lose everything. Because it was an open and shut case that the NUM and the NUR worked together if there was any strikes or and they couldn't work together because they were defeated before they'd started in that way. The railways weren't taking the coal out like they had been. So it was, for me, about defeating the trade unions. And that's what I think the Tory government of that day was about. Wow. And today.
Let's just open it up to floor. Anybody got any comments on what you've heard so far, or on that question?
The miners' union was a a very strong union, and I agree that it was they wanted to break the power of the unions because that was a voice that would have been against all the privatisation, all the things that they intended and continued to do, which we're seeing now.
Yeah. Any other comments? Yeah, over there. We've got microphones. Just try to spot somebody with a microphone. Yeah.
I worked for a mining engineering company from 1978 for 10 years. And the engineers used to talk about the Ridley Plan, and they said that the miners wouldn't know what had hit them. And they knew what was going on in 1978, 79, 80. Yeah. And they also were engineers that went down all the pits maintaining equipment, and they said that it wasn't necessary to close some of the pits, that there were 5 years coal and more in some of these pits, and they were very aware that it was a political decision to crush the miners.
Thank you for that comment. Anybody else? Somebody over there, look, have you got a microphone for this? Oh, you've got it, go on.
Yeah, Martin Brandenbarger mentioned the price of coal, but when we say the price of coal, what is the real price of coal? Yes. And to drive wages down all the time, I mean, who are they running the country for? The people who work in it? They want more on the dole, whatever it is, but you've got to pay properly.
I'm coming on to that question right away. There's a question about the social, cultural and financial costs of the price of coal, and I will be coming on to that question, but thank you for that point. Just one more point, because we've got other people to talk to on here as well, yeah?
To say the pit was shut because there was no coal down there, I was a miner until 2010, and the pit that I worked at was closed. There were still reserves underground.
Yes.
Now, surely, wouldn't it be better to get those reserves out than rely on the supplies, what we've got from the European countries at the minute that's unstable?
Yes, I have got a question about that as well. Thank you, but thank you for that point. I think we're getting I'm getting a sense from everybody that's spoken so far that it's not so much to do with what they were saying they were closing the pits for, but there's a sense of a battle being prepared, isn't there, from both sides? Yeah. Go on, let's...
I was going to say, I mean, was it economic or political? Yes, it was both. There'd been very much the post-war consensus where unions had been strong and negotiated for better wages and conditions, had broken down progressively through the 1970s. The Tory government was defeated in the early 70s. Labour had a lot of strife, had a plan in place. It didn't come to pass. Thatcher came to power and was very, very determined to move to a different economic model, one away from that consensus-based politics and far more towards one where there's essentially more conflict and tension in society. And the Tory line was very much that they were prepared to see far higher baseline unemployment, as we have now, than continue to support heavily unionised industries. And that's the way we've been pushed now. It was an economic decision taken to move the whole of this country very much to the right, and it was a political decision that was sort of built around that, a political sort of consensus that moved to the right, as we are seeing very much at the moment now, when this country is being pushed even further to the right with the rise of UKIP.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for that, Richard. Andy, you were a coal miner at the time of the strike. What's your answer to this question?
Well, like other people have said on the panel, I think it was both economical and political. And, as a coal miner, as someone who believes that the wealth is generated from those people who labour every day, all we ever wanted was not, Rolls Royces and a fancy car, but to look after our families and being involved in our community. And this government, this Thatcher government, it was ideologically driven then, as the people who've come along now, the sons of Thatcher at the moment, as it is today. And what they wanted to do, it was a return to neoliberalism, free market policies, where we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. And when we talk about, political economy, what I always believed in the seventh richest country on the planet, that we would cross-subsidy. So those bits that were making money, We would subsidise other bits, other essential parts of our economy, and energy is one of them, yes? So we could keep the lights on, yes? But this was economically, politically, ideologically driven by the dogma of the free market. And what started in 1979, we're still recipients of today. Really, we are. I mean, and it was a fork in the road for me, and it was high stakes. And I was a relatively young man. I was only 22 then. I would go out to meeting after meeting after meeting, and we were saying to people then, please join us. Our struggle is your struggle. Yes? And, you know, the person at the end, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name.
Martin.
Martin. At the end said about closing of pits in the 50s and the 60s. Well, there were different economic times in the 50s and the 60s. You know, I grew up in a mining community in Wigan that when they were closing some of the pits, if they'd have done a deal, the union had a deal to keep them open, they'd have gone mad because they'd had the payoff and they got a job down the road. But in 1984-85, just as today, that wasn't the case. In 1984-85, what had been orchestrated was mass unemployment. The post-war consensus, the first rule of every government up until Thatcher was full employment. It was in the Beveridge report, and we didn't have it. So when they came to our communities, when they said we're shutting your pit, and believe me, if everybody's worked down a coal mine, it's not a jolly experience. You know, it's graft, it's hard work, you work in dust. Yeah, when you're working in it, you think to yourself, why are human beings being subjected to this, to earn a living? I'm just being honest with you. But it's all we had. It was the dignity of work, yes? And if you ask most working people, yes, those that are in and those that are out of work, basically they just want the dignity of work. They want to be able to look after their families. So it was highly politicised, and Ian McGregor, he'd been in the steel industry and decimated that first. So he's in the NUM and he suddenly becomes the chairman of the National Coal Board. Then the writing's on the wall. If you read his book, I mean, I was at TOR. I mean, no apologies for being a socialist. No apologies for defending our interests. That's what it's all about. So if you read Ian McGregor's book called The Enemy Within, everything that's been said on the panel about the orchestration of the strike was absolutely true. Yes? But it gets more sinister than that. If you read Seamus Milne's book, he writes for The Guardian, that's also called The Enemy Within. How the Secret Service infiltrated the miners' union. So it is much more serious, this. It's about the fundamental reshaping of our society. And 30 years on, I mean, I'm so glad this is happening, these debates and brass stuff. I've been to Birchall this morning. But 30 years on, there's a void in our society that's been created through the 80s and the 90s by these awful, desperate market policies. I mean, we talk about, I'll finish in a minute, go on.
Okay.
We talk about economics, we talk about fairness. What's going on in the City of London? You know, what about tax avoidance and tax evasion?
Oh, come on.
You know, when we talk about economics, when we talk about getting hold of the money, if the rich would just pay it, we could share it amongst us, and we could create jobs and have services for all of us to participate in. So I make no apologies, but it was both political and economic, and until the day I die, I will always defend who I am, my class, and I hope one day we turn it round and we have a society that's worth belonging to and living in again. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Heartfelt opinions on all the panellists to start with. We've had 24 and a half minutes on that first question, so we'll try and push it along a little bit now because there's plenty to do. The lady in the red over there said about the true cost of the closures. This second question that I had handed in was, what has been the social, cultural and financial cost of closing the pits? That's a big question. I don't expect everybody to go into detail on every side of that question, but the social, cultural and financial costs. I'll come to you first, Richard, on this one. The social and cultural costs, perhaps.
Blimey. Well, huge. I'm originally from Worksop, North End of Nottinghamshire, and I remember that I was a mere teenager when the strike was on, I have to admit. But I do remember the impact and the miners being. I remember Arthur Scargill doing a speech behind the miners' welfare. And he was on the fire escape up at the side of the Regal Cinema because it was the only place where you could get a decent spot where everybody could see him. One of the things that was a real cultural problem was the divisiveness that it produced in a lot of communities, certainly where I was. In Worksop, we had pits that, even though it was in Nottinghamshire, Manton was in the South Yorkshire coalfield, and I think it was Shire Oaks was in the Nottinghamshire one, and there was other pits as well. So we were on the border of the NUM-UDM split, and that caused a lot of problems and a lot of contention in the community. It also had a cultural impact in that people felt that they were living under, police observation a lot of the time. I mentioned Orgreave. My mother at the time was a teacher in Sheffield, and she drove to work every day, and there were police on the way into Sheffield and by Orgreave, and they saw her in the car as a woman on her own, waved her through, no problem. If there was a car with more than one man in it, they'd stop you. Where are you going? What are you up to? And there was that fear of being sort of, persecuted and sort of kept tabs on the whole time. In terms of the...
Do you think that sense of persecution, there's a legacy still today?
I think there are still communities now that are split, and I think there's a feeling that, well, it wasn't just a feeling of persecution, it was definitely persecution. It was persecution by the state of the people who were trying to go to work, who wanted to work, but were being prevented from working by the actions of the government. Mm. That was the problem. Mm. And the financial costs have been huge because you've got, as I said earlier, the move was to move the whole economic basis of this country to the right, and the result has been the creation of acceptance of a large number of unemployed people. And we're seeing what's now called, the chavs and the demonisation of that and the demonisation of the working class. And that has been... No, you can't laugh. That is true. There are TV programmes where you can... What about Benefit Street? What about Benefit Street? If that wasn't demonisation of people who don't have jobs, what was it? That was about saying, look at these people, aren't they terrible? And that to allow you to justify taking benefits away from them, from making life that's difficult for people, because they were hardly living in palaces. Making life that's hard for people even harder, and making people more accepting of lower wages, of not being able to campaign for better wages and better conditions, to make it harder for ordinary working people to get decent conditions in this country. And that, I think, is a cultural impact that's still going on. It's a social impact that's still going on, and it's definitely a financial one.
Martin, I saw you tutting when Richard suggested that the working class have been demonised by things like this.
Well, I totally disagree with him. And it wasn't just the police that you might be criticising. Perhaps you'll remember that when some miners that had voted to work were in a car and they had a concrete block dropped on them from the motorway. So it wasn't just the police that were acting badly. There were a lot of striking miners that didn't give a damn about the lives of those in the UDM that wanted to work.
The police were the hands of the state in that strike, just as they are now. A couple of years ago, there was a large demonstration at Ratcliffe-on-Soar Power Station. It was called the Climate Swoop, and it was against sort of increasing carbon emissions. And the police were there, but also the police agents provocateurs were there as well. Because there were people there from the Green Movement who recognised them, because they used to be the same agents provocateurs who used to be there against in things like hunt saboteurs and that kind of thing. And we've also found the absolutely disgusting situation where police have been undercover for over a decade, building up false relationships with people, having children with people, for God's sake. I mean, that's practically rape. I mean, the people,
forgive
the
me,
state,
I'm assuming the two people consented.
They would have consented because they thought the person was something entirely that they weren't. They didn't know they were a police agent. They didn't know that they were being there to spy on people.
So forgive me, what you're saying is it's okay because you believe that we shouldn't be burning coal, because that's what that problem was, the power station. They could break in, smash all the fences and wreck the power station because they didn't believe we should be burning coal. I'm sorry, that's unacceptable.
I believe there's a legitimate right to
protest.
No,
there isn't.
There's a legitimate right to protest that doesn't involve the police having people undercover sleeping with protesters.
You're ducking the issue.
No, nobody's ducking the issue. Let's just talk. Martin, have you visited a former coal mining village?
Yes, and I've been down a few pits too.
In recent years, and have you seen what has been left from
Sorry?
the strike?
Gedling was my last one. Yes.
Have you ever been to Langford?
No, there was one in Staffordshire I went to. Sorry?
Go and have a look at Langworth. That'll give you an insight into what it's done to mining communities.
Do you feel any guilt about
I don't.
boarded
That's
up
not the
shops
same,
and lack of open drug problems?
That's not the same thing as saying I'm not totally sympathetic to the problems we were faced with, the social problems, the cultural problems. I'm not ducking. They were very difficult issues and I wish it could have been handled better. But the job had to be done. That's the difference. The gentleman is talking about burning. We're supposed to be trying to burn less and less coal. There's a thing called global warming taking place. They're talking, you may come on to it later, of clean coal technology. But that's miles from being anywhere near worthwhile at this stage. In fact, the so-called carbon capture is going to be much easier to deal with the oil industry and the gas industry. The coal one is a very, very difficult. I know you're shaking your head, but it's a very difficult one and very expensive. And even if you could, you've still got the problem of the enormous cost of deep mine coaling in this country. And I think you might well...
I'll just come to you.
It's all about Martin.
You've also made the point. I know before the strike, during and after, because I was a Nottingham MP, I was talking to lots of different miners.
Yeah.
And one of the
did they ever say to you there'll be boarded up shops and drug problems?
Chairman, please,
no, that's just a question to you.
Let me finish my point.
Let him do his bit.
That the one thing that came across to me were the miners that were saying, well, I like my job and I don't want my pit to close, but I don't want my son and I don't want my grandson climbing miles beneath the earth to dig coal. And I said, you can't have it both ways.
But you can. Can I come in on that point? Can I come in? You actually can, because economics is not just about digging coal. It's about giving people a job, a viable job. And the thing is, about a society and an economy is in transition, it's the managing of that. So if you were closing, if you're actually closing a coal mine or a steelworks or a shipyard or Asda or whatever you choose to close, just to hand someone after 30 days or 45 days notice your redundancy and then cast them to the whims of the free market, yes, and then when they go to the unemployed centre, they're in a queue and they write letter after letter after letter for a job. If you manage that transition better, if there were jobs to go to, jobs with decent terms and conditions of employment, where we could earn a living for our families, where you could participate in the community you belong to, then no problem. But that didn't happen. And I tell you what happened, right? Because the pit that I was at, it was socially active. They weren't just the people that I work with. They were the people that we socialised with, that we debated with. My politics wasn't learned at university. My politics was learned underground, debating issues. My politics was learned from the community that I grew up in. And socially, it was ravaged. The culture of the coal mine that I was to, we had a brass band. Today, I'll watch this tonight, and as soon as the brass band start playing, I'll start crying, right? Because I miss the social and cultural world that I grew up in, yes? The pit baths, he used to play the euphonium, George's name, we were getting ready to change for night shift, and we'd say, go on George, give it some stick, right? This was social bonding. This was a culture that I'm proud to belong to, yes? And one thing, the people of the miners in the room will understand this. When you work in that sort of environment, the strong bonds that you have, because you know at any time, if it happens to you, you need your mates, and your mates need you, yes? And when that happens, there's no shortage of volunteers. People don't look at the shoes, they stand up. What, there's a mate in trouble, where do we go? How do we help? That was, and then they shut the pits. They shut the pits. That culture, the things that we value, the thing that we believe in, socially, your heart starts to go. You've no money, you can't participate. You end up on the dole. Some of my mates ended up on drugs. Some of my mates, actually, I have to be careful because sometimes I might cry because 2 of my mates, through desperation, committed suicide. They couldn't cope with it. This is not what you hear from any politician. This is the real world of desperation that free marketeers create for the rest of us. Yes?
Thank you for that. Let's Jean, you wanted to come in on some
Thursday, I was talking to a research worker who said that the technology to produce clean coal without hundreds of miners going down the pit was there when the big strike started. So that's a myth that the technology is not there. But when the pits were closed, as in my village, the heart was ripped out of the village. The miners' welfare closed, and they provided all the leisure activities, the Christmas parties for the kids, the bonfires, Easter, the village gala, which everybody else in the village helped with, art classes, all sorts of things. And all that died. And there's been never anything to replace it in the last 30 years. So the only thing that the bosses wanted to replace it with was, we have a lovely area called the Willow Bank, and it's a beautiful wild area, wild orchids, a Roman road, all those sorts of things. And they applied to opencast it. We, Women Against Pit Closures, got together and fought that decision. They got to the stage where they were bringing the big demonstration of what they wanted to do down the pit, at the opencast. 28 double-decker buses deep they wanted to dig. Now that is ridiculous. And it's not the dust that you see that does the damage. It's the dust that you don't see that kills people. And it's bad enough miners having to go down the pit. But to put that onto 6 communities around that Willowbank area is dreadful. Asthma and things like that are all on the increase, and these are the things that is creating it. What happened in my village was that people then went out and worked in the call centres that they produced for minimum wage, and you couldn't exist on one wage, so both mother and father had to go out to be able to have any sort of a livelihood. All the public houses closed in the village, even the chapels closed, and we were left with one church and one chapel. And there was nothing, there is nothing now to build that community around. So, and the story about the young man who came home from the army, fairly early on in the strike, a Doncaster lad went home and his mum said, "I'll unpack your case for you, son." No, mother, it's all right, I'll do it. It's all right, son, I'll do it. Mother, I want to do it. He took the case upstairs, and his mum sneaked upstairs and opened his case, and she unpacked a police uniform. Now tell me that the army wasn't involved with the miners' strike. And that split that family right down the middle.
Thanks, Jean. Martin, it's quite obvious from what everybody's saying that the social life, the cultural life, the village life, the sense of community was completely sucked out of a lot of places by Conservative politics. Did you were a member of the Conservative Party at that time. Did anybody ever say to you, do we care?
Yes, people did care. And it wasn't the first...
But what did they do to show that they cared?
Well, please, let me just quickly come back before it's forgotten, because Jean made a very good comment that the technology is there. That's perfectly true. The one technology that could use coal, and probably fairly quickly, is what is known as coal bed methane technology.
And the technology to dig it.
Forgive me, you don't dig it, that's the whole point. It doesn't need, you said yourself, you don't need to send, men underground. You tell me if the NUM is going to support an industry where you don't send the men underground, because that's not mining. It's done with steam and oxygen, and it produces syngas.
It's about the benefits going back to the community.
But they're not...
Don't you see that the wealth that we create, we want to share in? Don't you see, right, that people like me don't come on a platform like this today to want to have participate in our society and economy for me? Yes?
No, neither do I.
We want to participate in our society so everybody can share in the wealth that we produce. Yes? Really, not just in this country, but throughout the world. Now, we live in a society where that doesn't happen. People like you don't aspire to those values. Yes? We're diametrically
I'd be grateful
opposed.
if you didn't accuse me of something that isn't true.
Thought you said there were no society.
If you read the whole speech, you'd have taken a different view.
No. That's what she said, there's no such thing as society.
Do you believe there's such a thing as society?
Of course there is.
Okay. Anybody who'd like to join in on this question? I'm moving on to the clean coal question in a moment. Yes, sir. Just a minute. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm a Labour councillor, but I've got to give some credence to Martin, actually, for coming here, because he's the only voice on the panel who's put in the other side. But just as someone said earlier, you know, the miners' strike, the crushing of the strike was political, and also they said what's happening now, the spare room subsidy, as it's grandly called, or the bedroom tax to others, you know, the attack on the poor and vulnerable, whether they're immigrants, whether they're unemployed. It's just horrific, and I think actually that we're in a worse state than we were in the 1980s. Now, Martin mentioned twice Gedling Pit, and I know a bit about it because I live in the Gedling constituency. That is not a pit village. There was a pit estate there, but it's not a pit village. It's these isolated pit villages that some people have been talking about.
I agree.
And one that I've seen, Blenarvan in Wales, which is, I believe it's a World Heritage Site. They've got a big pit museum there. But it's right in the Welsh Valleys. There's nothing else there. There's no employment. And if you want to stop people from digging hundreds of meters below the ground, as Martin said, I don't think anybody wants that. You have to provide some alternative employment. And as the gentleman over there says, cross-subsidy, that's the way to do it. That's the big society that Cameron and his lot are destroying.
Thank you. Yes, over there, please, in the grey jacket.
The price is still being paid by communities in Derbyshire and in Nottinghamshire. Langworth has been mentioned. I think of Harworth in Nottinghamshire. I think of Langode. Those are communities that have had the heart ripped out of them. One of the things that also is the things you don't see is the families that are not talking to each other. Are the people, as you said, who, are seriously ill mentally through drugs, others who did commit suicide, people who went on to try and find a job and worked hard to try and find a job, and what they got was small-time jobs and people think. And in the community, I arrived in Worksop in 1981, and so I lived through we were there through the strike, and there are people there I know today who are still suffering because of the strike, and that's the price. But I would agree, closing the pits, 90 days notice. I stood for election. I went to a selection meeting to stand as a councillor on the same day that Manton Pit was announced it was closing in 1994. And the Worksop, and certainly Manton, has not recovered from that shock yet.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to move on because there's more questions, and I'm looking at the clock. It's already been hinted about the clean coal technologies. We've got a question here from Jane Bramley. Jane, are you here? You were. Oh, you're there, Jane. Sorry, Jane. I've got it written down here. Before it's too late, should we be reinvesting in clean coal technology? This is in line with another point that I've got there. Right, up to 1989, Grimethorpe had been a centre for research into this environmentally cleaner technologies, and it was just shut down. Should we be looking at cleaner technologies? I've got to ask Richard this one first. He's our Green representative, and then I'll come on to you. Go on.
It's interesting. I think we were talking about this just before we came on. There was a bit about fluid bed combustion and that kind of thing, which was looked into at the time. And at the time, it would have been something that would have been worth taking forward. It's certainly worth developing the technology. There are a lot of technologies out there, even if it wasn't used for coal that was taken out of the ground in this country, then at least we'd have a decent technology that we could sell and license to other pits around the world. We're very good at inventing things in this country, and we're very, very bad at actually developing them and actually making the money out of them around the world. And that's any kind of technology, it seems, these days. From the Green point of view, what we were saying at the time, as the Ecology Party as we were, is that we were saying we would have kept the pits open and then in the interim transitioned to a low carbon economy. But that didn't happen because we had the dash for gas, we had some new nuclear build proposed, the pits were shut sort of at a breakneck speed, as Keith said. Our position is still the same on that. We still need to see that transition to a lower carbon economy. It's very clear now, even more than in the 1970s, that climate change is happening, that it is due to the vast amounts of carbon that's being put into the atmosphere, primarily through human activity. It's worth looking at the technologies, but certainly we would want to see much more invested in solar, wind, wave, combined heat and power, those things, and do that on a decentralized way as well, so that you're actually generating the power much closer to the place that it's used, so you don't get the huge losses that you do with transmission. It's about 30% loss on the transmission across the networks that we have at the moment. There's a lot of new technologies out there that can be used. This might be one that, even if we didn't use it in this country, we should certainly look at and develop for the future.
Thank you very much. Keith, what's the Miners' Union view on this? Or your own personal view. Let's have your own personal view.
Before I retired, I used to sit on a government body which was called the Coal Forum. And we used to meet, and it involved the miners' unions, the coal owners, the power stations, everybody that had anything to do with coal was pulled in there. Europe made a promise that they were prepared to allow for 12 demonstration plants to be spread out across Europe. The disappointment of the Coal Forum was that the government of the day in Britain agreed to one. And again, the disappointment was that they had to have a beauty parade to find out who could actually have that demonstration plant. We know full well that carbon capture and storage works. There are already plants in Canada that's using it, and they say that it cuts to at least 90% of the CO emissions out. So you're talking about burning coal at around 10%. So we know full well that there's the possibilities of coal coming back into stream. We're looking at, and the Coal Forum even today that sits today, is looking at producing coal at clean coal technology plants and producing at least 10 megawatts to 15 megawatts right up to 2030. So there's a goal out there. What's disappointing as well is that the Grimethorpe project was stopped because the funding for that project was stopped by the Tories.
Thank you for that, Andy. What?
Well, obviously, you know, the planet is warming up, and carbon in the atmosphere is and so with this technology, up to 90% is taken out. So I think we should have investment in it. I mean, I've made my case for coal and cross subsidy of quite a few energy sectors. So yes, let's put more money into it, and I think it should be top of the agenda. Should we have a change of government, hopefully in 2015?
Jean, you wanted to say
I think one thing that we all forget is that we're transporting coal around the world like it's never been transported before. It all goes into some docks in Holland, and then ours comes over to Britain. And what's that doing to the climate? If we were digging ours out, it's near to where we're going to use it. It's not millions of miles away where the ships have got to go around the world, but also steel. We have to import steel if we want it now. And we even get milk from France, can you believe it? And our electricity comes over the channel. How ridiculous is that when we can create it in this country and give our people some dignity and some jobs that they can be proud of?
Just to come back on that, Ian, the UK last year turned 17 million tonnes of coal out. We imported 44 million tonnes. And the overall burn in Great Britain was 67 million tonnes. We're sitting on 4,600,000,000 tonnes of coal. We should be opening pits up again and forming our own energy, especially if carbon capture and storage can reduce the emissions down to 10%, as the Coal Forum's saying.
Is there a case, Martin, for reopening pits and finding work for people to do near to where they live?
I don't want to see the next generation and the one after that crawling miles underground in one of the most dangerous industries we've ever had. If there's another way of producing the energy the country needs, then that is what we have to do.
Do you mind?
The question
sorry, just before you go on, you seem very concerned that people are crawling miles underground in a very dirty industry.
Yeah.
We import 55 million tonnes of coal.
Yes.
Do you think that comes by magic?
No, it doesn't. But I can
But people actually crawl to get that coal as well.
Well, funnily enough, a lot of it comes from Australia, and they don't.
But
Because they don't
underground.
call it open cast. It's giant pits, and I've been there and watched. That's how I realised how cheap Australian coal is. You virtually just pick it up in great bucket loads.
They've got deep mines, though.
Yeah, but most of it comes from these pits.
What about
they're not pits as we understand.
What about the places where 9-year-old children are still digging it out and we
Disgusting.
import coal from there?
Wrong.
I've worked underground for 30 years, and I will be proud to see my son work underground. It's an hard life, but it's an honest life.
I prefer to see them doing something different. Well, everybody is hung up on the fact that it's only the Tories that create unemployment. Perhaps somebody will tell me when I'm wrong. But when Mrs. Thatcher got elected in 1979 and left office in 89, the unemployment was lower when she left than when she took office. That is a fact.
Part-time, low-paid jobs.
You've always got an excuse. I'm giving you the basic fact.
Close 97.
Sorry, don't all talk at once. You had a point there. Go on, just make your point.
People that are in Parliament now...
Sorry, I can't hear you. Can you have a microphone?
Okay, people that are in Parliament now, most of the MPs or the ones at the top, they're rich people. They're never going to understand the lives of working class people, no matter what you tell them. They really don't understand what life is about. And, you know, and who are we running the country for? And the gap between the rich and the poor is wider and wider these days. Things are getting worse, and it is the Tories that are doing it. If it's not them, it's really right-wing Labour, possibly. But we can see the difference between people at the top and working people.
Chairman, there seems to be an assumption that all the Tory MPs are rich toffs and all the Labour Party are working class. That is crap.
The ones running the country are.
I beg your pardon?
The ones running the country, the ones in the cabinet, how many of them are working class?
Probably not many.
There's none.
Let's not have the debate about that. Let's pick up a point of what you've just said, that the gap between rich and poor is getting wider. And that's, yeah, there are statistics that say that. Has anybody got a comment on that? Sorry, where are you?
I'm here.
Yeah, go on.
I've been to a rare place today called an old coal mine called Maltby up in Rotherham, which shut last year. That colliery, in 1980, I'd invested in it £120 million. The Tory government, when they came in 79 up to the mid-80s, invested, I can't remember the exact figure, I think it's nearly £1 billion in the coal industry. I'm a businessman myself, and if I've invested that amount of money into a company, surely to God, I won't shut it. I'd build up on what I'd invested in for the future.
Yes.
So the bit I can't grasp now is, I was stood in that coal plant today, ready for blowing it up in a couple of weeks' time, thinking, only £120 million of my money going. What's the economic case of that? And I'd like to point that to you, Stuart.
Okay. Quickly, Martin, do you want to answer that? What is the point of investing £200 million in something that you're going to close down?
There are tens of thousands of instances throughout industry and commerce where people have made an investment in good faith because they'd thought it through or thought they had, and 2 or 3 years later realised they'd made a wrong decision. And in this so-called wicked free market economy, they realised they'd made a wrong decision and back off. And
I call that bit uneconomical.
No, I said I don't know that particular one. As a general thing in business, if you've made a wrong decision, you don't chuck good money after bad, you say enough. We'll use what we've got for something else. And that happens as normal in industry and commerce, and it's something I'm afraid certain unions won't face up to. It has to happen that way. Shops open and close, industries get started, grow and fade away. It has happened for centuries, it'll go on happening. How many people here, for instance, say 10 years ago, had an iPad or a tablet as an everyday item? It didn't exist 10 years ago. When I got into Parliament, everything was pen and paper and letter writing. We didn't have emails. The world is changing and you can't duck it.
Okay.
Is this, Chair, is this why we're now looking at doing fracking? Because that's another thing that I think we need to fight against. They tried it in Blackpool. They had some earth shudders and closed that down. They're bringing it now into other areas. In America, they have lots of land that nobody lives in. It's a massive country compared to ours. Our country, if we get earth shudders, then it affects people and livelihoods.
If it happens, it will have to be done with great care and with strict regulation. But I'm glad you've raised it, because to be fair, the people are mad keen on fracking have admitted that because it's a small country, because a lot of it is built up, they'd be very lucky if they got more than 10% of what's there out economically. Now, it would be nice if our NUM, who love to trot out this 300 years of coal underneath, how much of that could we actually get out economically and practically? They won't tell you, they just quote the 300 years of stock and just assume we could have it all. You wouldn't be able to. Fact.
As you say, new technology would provide,
but it wouldn't send people underground.
What should happen, of course, is to subsidise it the way that the Tories subsidised nuclear power. When that was being brought in the first stages, we had the fossil fuel levy. The coal mines were paying for nuclear power. Nobody's ever told me what it's going to cost to decommission a nuclear power plant. What's going to happen to the waste from the nuclear power? Nobody's answered any of that. That's more environmentally unfriendly than coal will ever be.
Sorry, let's just, before you go any further, I just want to, Andy wanted to make a point. He's been waiting patiently.
I know people are... the thing is about opening coal mines, it wasn't the best job in the world. It was a graft. It was dignified work, and the bond that we had with one another was something very special. Yes. But if we are going to open coal mines again, yes, seriously, it's got to be on our terms. It's got to be on the terms of the people who are going to work it. Watch the clock. So what we can't have, and I know what's being proposed at the moment, is opening up pits again. Maybe they're talking about it in the Vale of York. That'd be 5,000 jobs associated with it. But what we don't want is saying, well, there's 5,000 jobs here, and then we get an employer who sinks the shafts, who drives people into working 10-hour shifts, who they have to watch the backs over holidays. You know, so if we are going to do this as a society, and we are going to say people are going down coal mines, I know there still are, there's 3 still open. 187 actually, when in 84, 3 left, but there you go. But if that's going to happen, then I think there should be some sort of thank you from our society and say you shouldn't be able to subject yourself to those sort of conditions for more than something like 25 years, and we'll finish you like the police force do on a pension. They have to be publicly owned and controlled. Yes, we have to be part of a planned energy policy across the board. And I remember when Arthur Scargill used to come round, he used to say to us, if they gave us the same subsidies in the coal industry in 84, 85 that they gave to the nuclear industry, we could mine the coal, give it away, and give everybody £10 a tonne as well. Yes? Now, that was the economics of it. That was the economics of it. And any society, and it's a very, very dangerous game not having your own secure energy supply. Look what's going on at the moment. You know, we talk about politics. Look what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment with Russia. Yes? If that actually turns into some sort of conflict and war, and the Russians start turning the gas off, there is politics around security and tenature of your own energy supply. We're not talking about mobile phones. But obviously, you know, I mean, I've got one. You know, it's brilliant, right? But we're talking about the serious planning of a nation's energy supply, and no one's done this of all political persuasion since the miners' strike. Since the miners' strike. So I'm for opening pits, but not on their terms. Yeah, I'm for opening pits on our terms, because that's what the 84-85 miners' strike was all about. Yes?
It brings us neatly, actually, onto another question. It's a well-made point. It brings us neatly onto this question of common ownership of future energy resources and the security of those. What are the pros and cons of nationalisation versus privatisation for these energy industries in the future? You can start on that one, if you wouldn't mind, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about security of supply. That was one of the things. I mean, as we've seen the situation in the Crimea and the Ukraine at the moment, If you look at a map of the Ukraine, I've actually been told to call it Ukraine and not call it the Ukraine, but I can't stop myself doing this. If you look at the eastern part of that country, that's where all the gas supplies are, and that's where actually the majority Russian population is. So if Russia decides to sort of go and nab part of that country, of Ukraine, then the bit they're probably going to take, other than Crimea, is the bit that's got all the gas supplies that comes in pipelines across the Ukraine, across Europe, through Germany, and to us. And I have to say that lots of the countries in Europe, between the former Soviet states and us, have got much more infrastructure in place for storing gas than we have in this country. We don't have all those gasometers around the place that we used to. You look across in Germany and in Central Europe, they've got a lot more sort of long-term supply. They've thought about it. They've done the equivalent of doing the stockpiling just in case, though it's not for so long. Certainly from the Green Party's point of view, if it comes to the electricity industry, we would like to see the distribution part of the network, the distribution network, back in public hands. We think that should be something that's a nationalised industry. In terms of the actual production of energy, we're prepared to see more of a mix, and that's partly because there are some good companies out there that are doing some low carbon work, investing in wind and in wave power and so on, and we want to see some more of that. And it is possible to go down that route and have much greener, cleaner energy supply. In terms of nationalisation or privatisation of any pits that reopened, I think that if we've seen what happens with the private industry and that rush to the bottom in terms of wages, and I don't think that it would be good to go down that route and have a set of private pits everywhere, because all that happened was they were nationalised, they became privatised, and then they were closed down in very short order, and then we're importing lots of coal from Poland, from Australia, and so on, which is, as has already been said, is absolutely ridiculous that we're transporting, we're effectively using vast amounts of carbon to transport vast amounts of carbon across the globe. And that's absolutely crazy. We should be producing and using energy as locally as possible. And if it can be done through state ownership as a part of a carefully regulated industry, then so much the better.
Well done. We local work for local people, should this be nationalised? In all the cases, not just coal, energy.
The National Union of Mineworkers have always maintained that you can't privatise your energy industries, because you end up having problems like we've had with people paying the extortionate prices for gas, and coal is right at the bottom of that, and I've got to keep promoting coal, because if you look at the burn last year, 41% of our energy needs was coal. It's the top in the pie chart for the whole of the country's energy. 27% of that were gas. And like our friends have said, if Russia turns the gas off, then they're going to rely even more on coal. Whenever there's a problem at the nuclear power stations, and it's coal that takes on the base load. So to nationalise a new coal industry would be our objective and our goal, because we believe that there's a place right at the top of the agenda. And the problem with governments is, no matter which they are, and I'm a Labour Party member, none of them have long-term energy policies. They're all short-term, and we ought to be looking further into the future to provide our energy needs.
Are our energy needs being sacrificed with short-termism, Martin?
Sadly, politics is all too often short-term. I accept that. It's very, very difficult in politics to really have long-term plans, because by the time they've come to fruition, you're no longer in government. And that's the problem at local level and at national level. Yeah, it's a problem. I accept that without any argument. But you have to say, with this argument about privatisation or nationalisation, you've got to be about, 45 or 50 years of age to have had any real experience or understanding of what things were like when all our main industries, not just coal, were nationalised and run by the whim, and it was the whim, of whoever was politically in control at the time.
Short-termism.
I agreed, short-termism. And I think, too, you would probably have to be around 60 years of age to try to have a conscious memory of just how many of the top union bosses back then were more concerned with politics and who runs the country, and they did that under the guise of looking after their workers. And frankly, in many, many cases, they were, how shall I say it, protecting their workers out of their jobs. The classic example was the British motor industry, which was an absolute disaster. Now, we're making more cars than we've ever done. It's all private. It's not nationalised. So, no, as far as I'm concerned, it has its faults, of course. And that is why, if you have privatisation, you have to have proper regulation, tough regulation. And as somebody mentioned, the nonsense with the bankers. Well, I'm sorry, you must ask Mr. Gordon Brown why he changed the regulatory system when he became Chancellor and why he created 3 different organisations to technically control the finances of this country, and they never talked to one another, and that's why we ended up in the damn mess that we were in.
Can there be a case for nationalising energy?
No.
Never?
No, I don't
Can
see
there
the
ever be a
point.
case for nationalising anything?
Why? Well, are you going to start arguing about nationalising Sainsbury's and Tesco's? Because that's essentially...
No, I asked you, can there be a case for nationalising anything?
No.
Why is some of our money, why are banks nationalised then, when they needed money?
That was the tragedy of the crash. That was a choice of 2 evils. If you actually have let those banks go through, more people would have suffered. So the government had no choice. But the sooner they're back in private hands under proper regulation, then it'll work.
Okay. We're coming to our close with 2 or 3 minutes left.
Anne's been flagging.
I beg your pardon. Go.
Very, very quickly. But privatisation for me, and I think for most of us, is about making money for the shareholders. Nothing to do with the workers. It's for making money for the shareholders. And the shareholders are people with money, not ordinary people like us. That's my point, if you want to.
I think...
Just let Andy speak. No, you've had your speak.
Let
Go on,
the
Andy.
Economist answer that question. Because one of the things that where companies make profits goes into the pension funds.
I'll answer
I'll
answer the question, because economics is not just about money, believe it or not.
No, it isn't.
Economics, the money is the finance. It's the oil in the machine's wheels. So you can have economies, actually, and there has been economies on the planet that haven't put money at the centre of it. Yes, it's only the neoliberals and the quest for profit maximisation to reap all the surplus for themselves. Yes, that where people, this is what we talk about, a new ideology. The new ideology of finance. This is not economy. This isn't what I'll talk about economics when we're talking about the finance of the City of London. We're talking about greed. Absolute, unadulterated greed. Set up by Thatcher, and I know Blur and Brown took it on, and we're not good on that road because I want to talk about nationalisation. Because the Conservative Party, believe it or not, are the party of the country. They wave the flag, land of open glory, and then they sell it off to the lowest bidder. Yes? That's what they've done to our country. Now, as a socialist, I'm an internationalist, but I'm also a realist. And if we don't have a society, an island, right, an island state, which says certain things, and one of them is energy, the other of them is food supply, yes? Now, I wouldn't bring Sainsbury's into public ownership. It would be, people who think we'd lost the plot. But how much subsidies do farmers get? Yes? If the miners got the same subsidies as your constituents, they want to close the pit.
I happen to recommend the city, not the farm.
Well, whatever. But
Andy, I've just got to.
So we have.
Let you finish off.
All right. We have a society. Look at the railways. Anybody in this room said the railways should be brought back under public ownership and renationalised? I travel on one every morning. I'm crammed on like cattle, yes, and pay dearly for it. And this was the utopia. We're all capitalists now. Look at the society we'll create. And this is what we've ended up with. There's got to be an alternative.
There's got to be an alternative, says Andy. And that gentleman there's very patiently had his hand up for ages. You've got 15 seconds.
Right. First of all, it's a load of rubbish to equate nationalising energy transmission with nationalising Sainsbury's. I mean, that insults our intelligence. Every economist will tell you that energy transmission and public transport networks are natural monopolies.
Yes.
They cannot work under these market forces. They don't work effectively. They're called market failures. So then we get the argument, oh, well, we have to have something like the market, but we can regulate it. As we've just heard from Martin, we need proper regulation. 30 years on, we still haven't ever had proper regulation. And the reason for that is neoliberal governments, whether they're Conservative, Liberal or Labour, and for the last 20 odd years they've all been neoliberal governments, want to deregulate. Their every instinct is not to regulate properly. Secondly, regulators get captured by their frequent users, i.e. the industries, the vested interests. And that's why we have the Office of Fair Trading that spends a lot of money, used to spend a lot of money saying, these are good reasons why we shouldn't enforce the competition laws. It's why we have, it's not just Gordon Brown, it's why we have banking regulators that don't regulate the bankers because they're captured by them. This idea that you can have natural monopolies in private hands and that somehow regulation will work and that politicians and vested interests won't intrude on that is nonsense.
Okay, I've got to stop you. Thank you very much.
One last thing. If I sound angry about this, and I'm almost as angry as Martin, it's because I remember that 70-pit closure thing. He may not have read it, but I am 55. I was there at the time. No friend of Scargill, but I remember people saying, you've got a hit list. And your government denied it.
Yes, they lied.
It can only
they
have been
did
a lie.
tell lies.
They did tell lies. They're still lying, by the way.
So, look, I don't know if debates ever make people change their minds. I don't think we've changed any minds in here tonight. But thank you for your attendance. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your contributions. And please thank the panel.